Buenos dias a todos. So those of you who've been to previous Sophos days in Madrid will realize that my Spanish hasn't gotten that much better. It's been 3 times now, and I keep promising Ruth that I will improve over time, but even though Duolingo says I'm 46% fluent in Spanish, I don't believe it. So welcome to Sophos Day Madrid, and my name is John Shier. I work in the office of the CTO doing research in all things security. Today, I want to talk to you a little bit about the threat landscape, the evolution of the threat landscape, and a lot of the economics behind what makes cybercrime tick. So we're going to do that by looking at one particular threat that you're quite familiar with, and we're going to look at the history of that threat, then dive into some of the current threats that we're seeing out of Sophos Labs today. As a matter of fact, if you go to sophos.com today/threat report, we released our threat report, our 2019 threat report just yesterday. And so there you can get the very latest in the happenings in the cybercrime underground and what the bad guys are doing. But I'll give you an insight into that today. So let's look at a bit of a history with ransomware to give us an idea about how the threat landscape evolves, and finally we'll get an idea of where it's going. So those of you who are old enough might have seen this at some point. This is the AIDS Trojan. Now, the AIDS Trojan is from back in 1989. This is the first recognized sample of ransomware that we know of. This was actually mailed to people, not emailed. 1989, it was mailed to people. Diskettes landed in your mailbox, and then if you inserted them into your computer, ran the program, you would eventually get this notification, which was basically a ransom note that said, if you want to keep using this program, which effectively had scrambled all of the directory and file names on your computer, then you had to pay $378 US to a post office box in Panama. No Bitcoin back in those days. What I think is interesting about this is the fact that it kind of looks a lot like some of the ransomware, the screens that we see today, and the price point is also very reminiscent of some of the ransomware that we see today. So for about 10 years, ransomware went away, and things were fairly quiet on that front. Cybercriminals were still doing their thing, but they were mostly, defacing websites and causing a nuisance and maybe doing some DDoS and things like that. But then, about 10 years ago, we got fake AV. When it came on the scene, it was rather shocking because people had never seen something like this before. Fake AV would pop up onto your machine and say that you had a virus. And unfortunately, all the good people that have, Sophos, and we see some Trend and some McAfee and some Kaspersky up there, none of these guys could deal with the threat, but only we could, a few handful of selected vendors up there, right? And so if you clicked on that free install button, well, up until that point, you weren't installed. And I apologize for the flickering. I think I've got some frequency issues with my laptop here. But what would happen is when you click that free install button, that's when you'd actually infect yourself, and then it would ask you for a payment in order to to get rid of the infection that was allegedly on your computer. Now, what these guys did was they actually accepted credit cards because they had to pretend to be a real security vendor. And so with cooperation between the security industry, law enforcement, and the payment card industry, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, we were able to actually shut down these guys by shutting down the revenue stream, by shutting down the money. Now, when this first hit, we saw a lot of copycats, a lot of other cyber criminals saw the money that was being made here, and they jumped on that bandwagon. And then next came the police lockers. And the police lockers were the next version of this sort of ransom-type behavior where you would get, again, a pop-up on your machine that said you were breaking the law somehow. Maybe you'd gotten some copyrighted materials illegally, MP3s, movies. Some went even as far as saying you had things like child pornography on your machine. And it usually came from the police, right? So the national police would say, all right, we've detected something on your machine, and you need to pay a fine. And this fine was now, instead of using things like Visa or MasterCard, because we couldn't do that anymore, they would go through intermediaries, like you see on the screen here, Ucash being one of them, Green Dot Money Pack. These prepaid cards that you would go to the store, give them 10 euros, 100 euros, whatever the actual amount was over here, and then you would type in the code on the back of that card into the screen. And depending on where you were from, you'd get a different screen. Here's one that's located here in Spain, but you can see some of the other countries that are available up there are represented as well. And so, again, with the cooperation between law enforcement, this payment card industry, and security industry, who we could see where this stuff was coming from, then we were able to shut down these guys. And as a matter of fact, if you went and bought one of these prepaid cards at one point, when this got really popular, because again, a lot of cyber criminals got into this, there would be warnings on the back of these cards telling you, hey, if you're coming here to buy one of these cards because one of these police locker things, don't. It's a scam. So everything was quiet until 2013 when Cryptolocker hit the scene. And this is the one that really told or showed cyber criminals how to do ransomware right. They paved the way for all of the other copycats that came after them. They were using PKI infrastructure, and they were using industry-grade, robust encryption, the same encryption that we use today to protect your data from thieves. And the other thing that happened is we started seeing the use of Bitcoin. Now, Bitcoin for them was great because it was available everywhere. You didn't have to worry about exchange rates. They didn't need to worry about that. It was, fairly anonymous enough for these guys. And they could be openly criminal. They could say, yeah, we're criminals and we're ransoming your computer, and so guess what? You owe us some money now. This is the Bitcoin address for Cryptolocker used at the very beginning of its lifetime, from September to November. And we took a snapshot back in November 2013, and you can see the amount of money that these crooks made in only 3 months of activity. Pretty impressive. And just like everything else, once one set of cyber criminals starts making money and shows everybody else how to do it, there's a relative explosion of these guys that hit the scene. So, one of the ways that ransomware works and is able to work, and a lot of malware is able to work, is through using exploits. Now, some of you might be familiar with this screen. You've probably seen it on some Sophos data sheets, or if you're a customer or you've seen a demo of this, These are the types of exploit techniques that cyber criminals are using to exploit your machine. I'm going to explain to you a few of them in the hopes that you can better understand the exploit techniques themselves to see what cyber criminals are doing. And I'm going to do this with a couple of analogies, stories. One of the first ones is the buffer overflow. This one's been around for a very, very long time, but cyber criminals are still today using this exploit to breach machines. Now, you can think of a buffer overflow, with these buckets here. Memory has boundaries, and these boundaries are constrained by the programs that are written to make things happen. So, only parts of memory should be written to by the program or by the user. So user input, when you put in your username and password, as an example, is one of these things that a program takes as user input and puts into memory. Now, you should be able to constrain that. You should be able to let only the amount of information that you need end up in those buckets. If you don't, it spills over into the red buckets, for example. Let me show it to you a little bit more graphically here. Let's say I have a spreadsheet, a program that keeps track of who I owe money to. And you can see I owe our CEO, Chris, here 40 euros, and my boss, Joe, 30 euros, and so on. But what I didn't realize was Chris, he was a bit of a hacker, and he found that there was a buffer overflow in the input function in the search field of my program. Because I let them have a search field so that they could see that the money that I think I owe them is the money that I actually owe them. So what Chris did is he went in there and he put in more input, because I didn't check to see how much input he was going to put in there. He put in more input than was technically allowed. And by doing that, he was able to go from one side of the boundary to the other side. So by writing extra data into that program, he was actually able to impact the amount of money that I wrote. So you can think of this side as the exploit and that side as the result. So now instead of owing him 40 euros, I owe him the GDP of a small country. The next one that cyber criminals use is something called DLL hijacking. And this is very simple. If I'm a bad guy and I want you to run bad code, maybe I just put the code on a machine somewhere where the program will automatically run it. And the way that that happens is by using this technique called DLL hijacking. Now, DLLs are helper programs. They help you do things like print and authentication and access the web so that you don't have to write it every single time for the program that you're writing. You can write it once for the operating system and everybody can use it. Now, programs always look locally when they go to load one of these DLLs. And when they load it, when it's local, what it can do is it can just load the DLL. But otherwise, if it's not there, it will go searching through the system to find the DLL it needs. This is very much like making cookies. A program has a set of instructions and has a set of ingredients it needs to run. And so as a bad guy now, if I want to ruin your cookies, let's say I take the sugar, right? And I put salt in the jar and I label it sugar and I put it right in front of you. As you're going through your recipe and looking for the different ingredients, the fridge for the milk and the cupboard for the flour, you'll see the sugar right in front of you, and you'll pick that up, put it in your cookies, and then all of a sudden your cookies are ruined. Bad guys are doing the same thing. They're taking DLLs that they've modified and are putting them in the directory of the program itself, and then the program will run that and run the bad code. A third example is what we call code caving. Now, this is taking bad code and shoving it directly into a program so that it runs alongside the good code. Think of this like reading a book. When you read a book, you get to the end of a chapter sometimes. The chapters are memory sections. And at the end of a chapter, sometimes there's a little bit of blank space, right? Chapters don't always end at the bottom of a page. Well, programs do that too. Sometimes there's a little bit of room at the end of the memory address space. And so what bad guys are going to do is they're going to take their code and put it in there. And so when the software runs, it will run the good code as well as the bad code. So in this example, it's like if I took this book and I typed out extra words at the bottom of the page in the same font, using the same typeface, and gave it to you, you probably wouldn't notice the difference. And then finally, something called process injection. And this is, we'll talk a little bit about fileless techniques later on, but process injection is taking my code and injecting it into memory into a known good process that is trusted by the operating system. What this does now is it allows you to run under a context that has elevated privileges and is trusted, but also is less suspicious. That's why we see a lot of malware under service host. If you open Task Manager today, you'll probably see a lot of service host instances running in your machine. And so process injection is a way for bad guys to get their code up into memory in a fileless way, because they'll often delete what's on the disk, and then run at higher privilege levels. And the analogy here is, it's like if you took a policeman's uniform and put it on, you'd have more power to be able to do things in the regular world than if you were just dressed like this. Office exploits are something that is commonly used for ransomware and other malware out there today. And what we've seen in Office exploits, we've seen a change recently, and this is from our 2019 threat report, where the bad guys are using more common and newer exploits now than they were before. In the past, they were using 2-, 3-, 4-year-old exploits in their kits, but now we can see that they're actually using 2017, 2018 exploits. As a matter of fact, 2012 0158, which is up here, used to be the reigning king, and now it's been pushed off to the side for newer exploits. Because one of the things that's happening now is we're patching more. That's great. Things like Windows 10, rolling patch updates. That's great. But these criminals are still figuring out ways of breaching our systems by using some of the latest and newest exploits that are available to them. And we see this very often where they use a chain of things. So you can see Windward over here that opens a command shell that finally launches PowerShell. Now, PowerShell is one of these things that is increasingly being used by cyber criminals as a way of executing their tasks on a system. And we need to really start rethinking now what we consider risky files, because back in the day, EXEs were risky files, right? Nowadays, there's a whole list of files here that you might want to consider treating differently, because it's no longer the case that we can just simply block EXEs and be done with it. Now we have to worry about a whole raft of different files. And the bad guys are using this technique that we're now calling living off the land, using the tools that are available on the system already installed in order to do their damage. This is a little bit like our friend here, MacGyver. So those of you who are old enough probably remember this TV show. But MacGyver was a guy who would often get into trouble, and in order to get out of trouble, he would fashion something out of the local materials he found around him, a stick and a piece of tape and I don't know, whatever he found. He would be able to fashion some vehicle or some weapon or something. And that's what the cyber criminals today are doing. They're looking at your system when they get on there and they go, okay, the Windows scripting host is installed and PowerShell is installed. I'm going to use those in order to do my attack. And what generally happens is these things get chained together. So you might get a .js file, a script that's part of a zip in an email. When you run the script, it calls PowerShell. PowerShell goes and downloads an exe, which drops a batch file. The exe runs, puts the code up into memory, and the batch file deletes everything. So because now the exe is ending up at the very end of this infection chain, that means that we can no longer, again, resort to just simply blocking exes. We have to look at the entire attack chain, which has made it more difficult to defend against. And this is what we call fileless techniques, when you have this chain of events that eventually ends up with something running in memory with no or little traces on the device itself, very little file artifacts that remain. Criminals are in it for making money. This is why they do this. There's no other reason for them to be in this, really, other than to make money, at least for the most part. Let's talk about the criminals versus the nation states. Nation states have other motivations, but the cyber criminals are in it to make money. And so they monetize everything. And those of you who were here last year, I did a deep dive on the dark web, and I showed you some of these things. Here's just a few things I found the other day that are specifically geared towards your region. And this is how they monetize some of their breaches and their thefts. You can see here, I can find an air miles account for Iberia. I can get a Spanish passport, and I can even get some stolen credit cards off the dark web. But let's talk about a new way that cyber criminals are monetizing your infrastructures. Something called cryptojacking. Now, cryptojacking, I'll explain in a little bit, but crypto mining, which is the underlying piece here, is a completely legal process. It's how you create value. It's how you create cryptocurrencies. And to do that, you need to solve some complex mathematical operations. You have to find some hashes. You need a lot of power. Now, cryptojacking, very simply, is just doing that without permission or consent. Think of it this way. Let's say I own a taxi, and I drive it around all day long. I collect fares. I make money. At night, I come home, and I park my taxi in my driveway. I have dinner with my family. I go to bed. I wake up the next morning, start all over again. Now, Alberto is a bad guy, and he's going to come up, and he's going to watch me for a little bit. That's what bad guys do. They watch what you're doing. And he's going to find out what my schedule is, and he's going to steal my taxi when he knows I'm sleeping. He's going to drive it around Madrid. He's going to collect fares. He's going to make money, but he's going to wear down my tires, my brakes. He's going to use my fuel, all for his own personal gain. This is exactly what cryptojacking is. It's using your resources for my personal gain. And the way that cryptojacking works, or the way that it manifests itself these days, is a couple of different ways. It seems to be getting worse. Well, I'm going to keep talking. Recently, we've seen a campaign where, in order to cryptojack, you either have to infect a bunch of computers and make them do it, or you can infect websites, but you need a lot of traffic. So some cyber criminals noticed that there was a vulnerability in these MikroTik routers that are at the core of many internet service providers. And so what they did was they thought, if we can infect these guys with crypto mining code, then every user that surfs through these devices will start crypto mining Monero, which is based off of the CoinHive algorithm. They'll start mining Monero for us. And so in a very easy way, they've concentrated the crypto mining through to this device. And so I thought I'd have a look here and see in Spain how many MikroTik devices are there that are currently infected with the CoinHive mining. Well, I say they're currently infected. Maybe some of the administrators chose to do this deliberately, but you can see there's over 1,000 devices here in Spain alone that are running this crypto mining code today. So that's one way that cyber criminals are now monetizing internet traffic, is by simply infecting routers and using your browser memory to actually mine for Bitcoins, for Monero. Now, let's leave the traditional platforms alone. Why not do this on every computing device if you can? And so we've also seen a shift towards crypto mining, cryptojacking on some mobile devices as well. So Sophos Labs did some research recently this year and found 25 apps that were actually crypto miners on the Google Play Store. And what was interesting about this, because cryptojacking, crypto mining is intensive, it uses a lot of CPU and memory, it has a tendency to, make the device go hot. We've heard stories of some mobile devices almost exploding because the battery got too hot. And so what these guys did is they actually throttled the CPU down to make sure that they wouldn't impact the device that much, so that they could last a lot longer. You can see the throttling here, 0.5, so that 50% of the CPU is the most that they would use. Now, the contrast to this, which I found interesting, was some of these guys that are using are injecting cryptojacking apps into the Android store are actually calling them battery optimizers, which, again, if you know anything about cryptojacking, not exactly a battery optimizer. And so Android is being targeted by a lot of this because of the openness of the environment, the openness of the framework, and the ease of which it is, you can get into being an Android developer as opposed to iOS. Another one that was really interesting that we saw very recently this year, and again from our threat report, if you want more information about these, go ahead and read it, is these apps that we call phishing in the app. And what these guys would do, and this is really interesting, because iOS, Apple and Android in their stores, they do try to scan for malicious apps, for malicious code, to make sure that nothing bad gets on the store. So what these guys did is they thought, well, let's publish an app that really doesn't do much. All it does is it launches Android's WebView browser. So it's really just a container app that launches a browser in the background, and these apps are disguising as bank account management tools. They even steal the logos and the graphics for the banks that they're targeting, and they ask you for your credit card, debit card, login information, all that kind of stuff. But what's really happening is they've just loaded up a web page that they've carefully constructed to look like an app. And so you put in your details, and it goes straight to the crooks. There was another one that was an eATM, which was, if you need cash, you don't really want to walk to the bank yourself, do you, and take it out? So these eATMs, what they would do is they would, you'd put in your debit card information and your username and password, and they would deliver the cash to you. So instead of you going down to the bank, you'd say withdraw 100 euros, they would take the euros and allegedly bring them to you. And so this is actually, in India, this was a very big problem this year. A lot of apps were doing this, but we're seeing a lot more of this, trying to circumvent the security of the Google Play Store by loading an app into the store that does nothing, allegedly, because there's no malicious code there. It's just simply a browser window, to try to get their apps more prominence into those stores and accepted in the first place. And so watch this space for this kind of activity to continue as cyber criminals are increasingly shifting their view to things like IoT and other mobile devices. The Mirai campaign that we saw a couple years ago that infected a lot of IoT devices has been copied as well. We're seeing a lot of different campaigns that are mirroring Mirai, and just this past year, the VPN filter botnet really took off and did a lot of damage. So we've looked at the past with ransomware. We've looked at what's currently happening today in the threat landscape. And because we're here to talk about the future of technology, let's talk a little bit about the future of cybercrime and see where the cyber criminals are now shifting their techniques, their tactics, their procedures, their tools, and how they're going to impact us in the year to come. And I'm going to tell that story again through the eyes of ransomware by talking about the SamSam ransomware and the gang that's behind this particular piece of malware. Now, the SamSam ransomware gang has been operating for around 3 years now, but they really made some big gains this past year, and they had some very widely publicized attacks. And one of them was against the city of Atlanta, where they shut down a very, very large portion of the city's infrastructure by deploying ransomware to a bunch of their computers. And this gang, the way they do it is they go to a more old school way of working, a more manual way of working. Now, this commodity malware that we see out there today, this explosion of malware, of ransomware, you know, it's great if you just want to, if you've got no skills and you just want to push a button and infect a bunch of people. But, you know, we've gotten pretty good at detecting this kind of stuff. And so what these guys did is they decided to go hipster. All custom-made, locally sourced malware. And the way that they operate is they try to breach your company. They try to get in one way or another. That might be very simply sending in a phishing email, and you just give up your credentials. They've been known to use vulnerabilities in things like JBoss servers. That's one of Oracle's web servers. And if they can get in that way, great. Now they're on your network. But more often than not, and their preferred method is to use RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. They'll simply scan the internet, look for juicy targets, and these guys appear to prefer healthcare organizations, but they don't discriminate. As we saw, they attacked the city of Atlanta and some other companies as well. But once they get in with the RDP server, they'll use other tools like Mimikatz to harvest credentials and elevate their privileges. They'll then use any of the tools that are at their disposal to carry out the second phase of the attack, which is the ransomware piece. And the way they do this is they do reconnaissance. They look around. They've got hopefully a domain admin account by this point with their Mimikatz work. What they'll do is they'll shut down all the other domain admin accounts. They might use some of your policy updating tools against you to change some of the desktop policies, some of the server policies. They'll find your backups and delete them and turn off the software. They'll even go so far as finding what security software you use and turn that off too. And then, because they know typically who they've breached and when they work, in the off hours, very often Friday night, very late Friday night on a weekend, on a holiday weekend, they will strike by encrypting all of your machines all at once. So now, instead of the €400 or €300 or whatever kind of single points of infection that the commodity ransomware guys are doing, these guys are infecting everything all at once and demanding 50,000, 60,000 for decryption. So if we look at what these guys are doing versus what the garden variety cyber criminals are doing, they're getting at least a 10x return on their activities. And we've seen and heard stories about the bad guys being in the network and the good guys being alerted that there's something going on and they're trying to turn stuff off, and the bad guys are like, they're fighting with each other on the network because they both have admin credentials they're actually having this small little battle within the network, trying to establish a foothold and trying to establish supremacy over the other. It got me thinking as well. Let's have a look at remote desktop and see what we can see by using Shodan. So 2.5 million RDP servers are currently exposed, at least according to Shodan, on the internet today. In Spain, we can see here 37,000 RDP servers are exposed, which means these are all targets for SamSam. But the thing is, SamSam was the first one. Like we've talked about, fake AV and police lockers and Cryptolocker. The first ones show the other ones how to do it. And we've seen copycats recently now doing the same thing. We've seen Dharma, Ryuk, BitPaymer, all employing this manual process to breach companies and infect all of their machines. And as a matter of fact, the prime method of breach for all of them is RDP. So if you want to use RDP, let's do it intelligently. Let's put them behind VPNs, hopefully a Sophos VPN. And let's use two-factor authentication. And let's not expose our RDP servers to the internet for anybody, including cyber criminals, to see. And as I kept digging, I found tons of them in Spain. And you can even get screenshots if you want. Now, these guys, because they are manual, because they are interactive, they also provide interactive support. And they will communicate with you if you have any issues. They will help you find a way to decrypt your files. They are just like any technical support organization, except for these guys don't work 24/7. They work Russian Standard Time hours. I'm just saying. So to date, these guys have made over 6.5 million US dollars, and that count is growing. And the reason they're making so much money, the reason they're so successful, is the devastation effect that these attacks are having is causing companies to pay at a much higher rate than the traditional commodity ransomware that we see today. And like I said, this is something that we're going to see probably a lot more of this year. We've got 4 criminal gangs that are doing it now, and some of the more skilled criminal gangs out there, and maybe some people we haven't heard of yet, are going to jump on this bandwagon and attempt to breach our companies. So when we talk about cybersecurity, when we read InfoSec news, it's a lot of negative, isn't it? We always hear about this company getting breached and that company getting hacked and, there's vulnerabilities in that software and the world is ending. I want to talk about some wins. I want to talk about some positive things that should make us all feel good as I wrap up my talk here, because we are doing some good. There's been a lot of battles. There's been a lot of fighting between cyber criminals and the InfoSec industry for 30 years now. And over time, we've learned some lessons and we've implemented some of those lessons. But, it takes time sometimes. But here's the thing. If you look at certain simple metrics like encryption on the web, a few years ago, less than 50% of the web was encrypted. Everything was in the clear. I could see everything you were doing. But now, with things like Let's Encrypt and other certificate authorities that are allowing you to secure your web properties for free, around 80% of the web is encrypted. That's a win. We are doing better. In the past, we would always say, you need to patch your stuff. You need to get rid of things like Adobe Flash, and you need to get rid of things like Adobe Reader, because they have a lot of vulnerabilities. And guess what? Over time, we've done that. We've gotten rid of Flash. The PDF viewers are now built into the browsers, which update silently and seamlessly without you having to do anything about it. And because of that, things like exploit kits have gone away. Things like drive-by installs have dramatically reduced. And that's a win. We've forced the cyber criminals to be better, to get better at what they're doing. And that's the reason that we're seeing things like SamSam out there today. We've developed technologies like anti-exploit that gets rid of those buffer overflows and those code injections very simply, which makes it harder for cyber criminals to breach your computers. We've developed things like behavior-based detections, like CryptoGuard, which looks at what ransomware is doing on a system and stops it in its tracks. And we've developed and introduced technologies like machine learning, which allows us to block never-before-seen destructive malware like we've never seen before. Those are all wins. We may have lost a few battles, but I think we're starting to win the war. And what's happened here is we've shifted the balance, the economics of cybercrime. We're making it more expensive for the cyber criminals to do their job. And to me, that's a win. So if we continue to work hard and work together to solve some of these problems, I think we can make the cyber criminals' lives a lot harder and maybe reduce the money that they're making and make our world a little bit safer along the way. So that's the view from Sophos Labs. That's the threat landscape, what we're seeing today. Later on today, and throughout the course of the day, you'll hear a little bit more about the future of technology and how Sophos can help you protect against a lot of these threats and many more. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.